Hello, I'm Jonathan Rayner. I teach film studies at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and my paper is entitled National Treasures and Cultural Repressions, Australia's Underground on Screen. This paper interprets the representation of mining and the significance of subterranean spaces in two depictions of contemporary Australia. Opal Dream from 2006, a co-production of the South Australian Film Corporation and the British BBC, is a family-orientated film that explores two parallel preoccupations: a father's fixation with finding opals to make his family rich, and his daughter's devotion to her imaginary friends. These twinned obsessions, the adult's failure to find one and the child's apparent loss of the other, prompt a sober reappraisal of meaning, community and value, and bring into focus contrasting concepts of individual and societal worth, and personal and national wealth. Firebite, a horror comedy television series from 2021, follows the adventures of an Aboriginal man and his adoptive daughter who hunt vampires inhabiting the maze of outback tunnels dug by opal miners. In Firebite, underground mining spaces do not hold hidden riches, but instead harbour an ancient, repressed cultural horror, originating from the first colonial invasion of the 18th century, but persisting into the present day. Both texts suggest the elusive potential of Australian underground spaces and their relevance to national discourses of the environment, economics and cultural history. Both productions were shot on location in Coober Pedy in South Australia, the centre of gemstone mining colloquially known as the opal capital of the world. The alteration of the natural environment by human mining activity has produced a striking and highly cinematic landscape, which director Warwick Thornton has described as the most beautiful man-made disaster in the world. Therefore, perhaps unsurprisingly, these stories, concerned principally with ideas of personal identity and concepts of wealth, influence and inheritance, narrativise the opal as Australia's official national gemstone. However, the fable or fantasy element to both productions via their association with the eccentric, individual pursuit of opal mining does not prevent their influence towards the significance of industrial mining to the national economy. Although both, therefore, concentrate on and seek to allegorise the specific notional wealth of precious stones in comparison with other sources of value, they also inevitably foreground Australia's status as a nation defined by mineral resources and notions of mineral wealth. Australia is a world-leading producer of 19 useful minerals, but is also a key exporter of coal and industrial metals, and an increasingly vital supplier of lithium for batteries. Mineral exports were worth $273 billion in 2020, with profits from mining representing 12 to 15% of total GDP by 2022. Mining may be celebrated as a deterministic part of the identity of Australian communities and regions, but it is an undeniably crucial component of the country's financial well-being and its regional and global trading and political relationships. Despite these inescapable economic realities, film and media representations of mining and its environmental effects have most frequently been couched in cultural, historical and sentimental terms. Representations of Australian landscapes on film have been frequent and varied, and have been the subject of extensive theorisation and critical interpretation in relation to discourses of national identity, history and belonging. While rural landscapes have been central to the national cinema's articulation of conflicts over land ownership, portrayals of the underground have received little representation, despite the country's over-reliance on such natural resources for its prosperity. Divergent understandings of Australian landscapes have underlined how Aboriginal rights, historical claims and capitalist realities collide and often compete in the national consciousness. The management of Australia's mineral wealth has therefore connected and heightened contemporary debates about the nation's cultural identity, economic stability and environmental responsibility. One of the first films to represent the inseparability of Aboriginal belief from the natural environment and its apparent incompatibility with the resource-intensive and extractive economies of present capitalist society was Werner Herzog's film Where the Green Ants Dream. More recent productions, such as Japanese Story and Red Dog, concentrate exclusively on non-Aboriginal characters' direct or peripheral involvement in modern mining, which is represented as an inevitable, profitable and productive use of a landscape apparently devoid of any Aboriginal presence. By contrast, Ivan Sen's thriller Goldstone forcibly foregrounds the contamination of the landscape and corruption of Australian society engendered by a rapacious culture of greed, but allows its Aboriginal character to reconnect with an erased traditional heritage. Although these films reflect the positive and negative representations of Australia's history of mining, from both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal perspectives, they depict its effects literally only on the surface: invisible commercial architecture, industrial waste, environmental damage, and inferred cultural erosion. By contrast, Opal Dream and Firebite deliberately reconnect with the subterranean space itself as specific symbol, setting, and signifier of Australia's mining legacy and its history within a cycle of extraction and replaying, excavation and burying, exploitation and protection. In Opal Dream, Rex's all-consuming and unrealizable desire to find opals to make his family rich is compared with his young daughter Kellyanne's complete devotion to her two imaginary friends. The father's staking of his family's security on the vain dream of finding opals parallels the daughter's withdrawal from reality in her imaginary friendships. While the family tolerates the father's obsession, Rex tries to dispel Kellyanne's fantasy by offering to take her imaginary friends mining with him. When he comes back, Kellyanne becomes distraught, saying her friends have not returned with him. Rex returns to his mine, pretending to look for her friends, but is accused of trespassing or ratting on another miner's claim, and is taken to court, placing the whole family's future in jeopardy. Kellyanne's brother Ashmole admires and trusts his father, and is similarly impatient with his sister's behaviour. When Kellyanne becomes seriously ill without her friends, Ashmole tries to help by also returning to his father's mine. He finds a large opal but keeps his discovery secret and tells Kellyanne that her friends are dead. Subsequently, Ashmole uses his opal to pay for his father's court defence and for a funeral for the imaginary friends. But he also shows his support for Kellyanne's fantasies by putting up posters in the town asking for help to find the missing persons. Ashmole's actions eventually overcome the hostility of the community towards Rex and Kellyanne, and the townsfolk attend the funeral for the imaginary friends. However, Kellyanne's health continues to deteriorate without her friends, and she dies. She is buried alongside her lost friends, but the family remains in the town, and Rex and Ashmole return to the hunt for opals. The film therefore provides a poignant and tragic story of competing obsessions and incompatible concepts of value. Kellyanne's fantasy may appear whimsical and innocent, but the parents' wish to remove this childish imaginary emotional support ultimately proves genuinely harmful. Rex's unsuccessful endeavours to find wealth, followed by his attempts to search for the lost friends, endanger rather than protect his family. By contrast, Ashmole's efforts, arising from different motives and devoted to his sister's system of beliefs and values, are successful in restoring familial, communal, and societal senses of value, putting mined wealth to good use. He even seems to find evidence that his sister's friends really exist, or at least existed. The father's avaricious resource extraction is therefore transformed into the brother's altruistic rescue effort. However, the death of Kellyanne cannot be avoided, exerting a fable-like punishment on the parents' selfish delusion. That Rex and Ashmole return to mining underground together after the loss of Kellyanne suggests a sadder and wiser reorientation of the motivation and purpose of hunting for treasure in the ground, with the search becoming one for belief and significant meaning, as much as or more than for wealth or prosperity. In Warwick Thornton's Firebite, the expected nationally determined significance of mining and underground space, of the search for treasure in the ground, and the ascription of value and title to found treasures are challenged, inverted, or parodied. In this story, Coober is ironically fictionalized as Opal City, a remote and largely subterranean town divided between individualistic white miners and a peripheralized Aboriginal community. Vampires come to the town with the connotations of travellers, tourists, consumers, and colonizers, drawn by two resources. One is the maze of opal miners' tunnels, which provide the perfect refuge from the pitiless desert sun. The other is Aboriginal blood, to which the vampires have become addicted, since being introduced to the continent with the first fleet settlers in the late 18th century. It is suggested that the vampires were transported purposefully to the continent in order to eradicate the indigenous inhabitants, with Thornton drawing inspiration from allegations of the deliberate introduction of smallpox to Aboriginal populations in newly settled New South Wales. The vampire's presence in the town, led by the last surviving king vampire who landed in 1788, provokes paradoxical questions of origination, belonging, and precursordom. The king predates everyone in the town, including its present-day Aboriginal inhabitants, but his arrival precipitates a new invasion, the influx of newly born vampires attracted by the oldest continental resource of all, Aboriginal blood. The vampires assert their antecedent right to rule and their superhuman ability to belong in the inhospitable environment, but they've been opposed in a 233-year-long war by Aboriginal hunters dedicated similarly to their eradication, in a paralleling, powerful and blunt allegorization of the historical colonial project. Within the tunnels around the town, the archetypal Australian activities of excavation, discovery, cultural preservation and treasure hunting are satirically reframed. While seeking the vampires, the Aboriginal hunters Tyson and Shanika occasionally come across opals, but use these solely to purchase the necessities required for the hunt. Instead of buying dynamite to mine for opals, the opals are bartered in order to buy dynamite to entomb the vampires. The tunnels hide the truth of the vampire's existence. Ironically, the Aboriginal hunters come across ancient carvings on the cave walls, echoing the cultural artworks of indigenous peoples, which preserve and communicate the vampire's history and culture. If the opals themselves in the mines become coincidental to the conflict, other manifestations of worth and treasure are nonetheless present. The vampires kidnap Aboriginal people and secrete them underground as valued sources of blood. The Aboriginal hunters' efforts to rescue their loved ones are driven by parallel motives to protect familial blood and ethnic and communal relationships. At the same time, subversively, the respected lore of the Aboriginal blood hunters is challenged and seen to be in need of updating and revision, in order to allow the teenage female Shanika to take on this traditionally secretive and male-only role. As much as a vampiric white enemy from the past must be opposed, then, Aboriginal identity must evolve in order to meet the challenges of contemporary society. The caves, therefore, become not only an arena for an apparently endless colonial battle for primacy, cultural ascendancy, and resource control, but also for ongoing conflict between evolving definitions of contemporary Australian and Aboriginal identities. The types of symbolic resource wealth the tunnels contain, the cultural legacies and differences they represent, and the conflicts they conceal, connect the diverse searches for value, the repression of the colonial past, and the revelation of present economic and environmental dilemmas at the centre of Australian nationhood. When the hunters come across a cavern lined with skulls, it is not immediately clear if these are the remains of the vampire's victims, or those of generations of the vampires themselves. But the subterranean space speaks to decades and generations of conflict, which must be brought to light, but equally must be brought to an end, in coexistence rather than genocide. The last Aboriginal blood hunter, Jalambiri, describes the thirst of the colonisers as never-ending, but the series' cultural metaphor of vampirism is paralleled by its allegory of resource extraction, as a colonial disease which has evolved into a capitalist addiction to the country's wealth, which will be ultimately ruinous to the world's as well as the continent's inhabitants. In their analyses of the filmic depiction of contested Australian landscapes, Peter Mitchell and Jane Stadler have observed how representations of space and place are always ideological, always implicated in some form of nation building or identity formation. In the case of the two productions discussed in this paper, present economic realities and unbearable cultural pasts are represented in the tangible, real, but also imagined, fictive and mythic geographies of Australia's underground, a hidden and under-acknowledged space at the centre of a nexus of nation power knowledge. Given that these both foreground youth consciousness and action in relation to the meanings and values of underground wealth, these productions also poignantly flank the eruption of student environmental protests in Australia, focusing on the effects of climate change on Australia precipitated by the use of exported Australian mineral resources, such as coal. Apparently without irony, Australian politicians voiced their impatience with the student protests by recommending the pupils privilege academic learning over activism and return to their schools in order to learn about important national subjects, like mining. In promoting consciousness of the importance of the underground, in reframing scales of value attached to what is extracted or recovered from, or should be returned to the ground, and reimagining national and personal senses of accountability towards what constitutes wealth and worth through depictions of the underground. Opal Dream and Firebite provide pertinent allegories of Australian society's relationship with and responsibility for its precious resources. Thank you.